Hello again, everybody. It is time once again for the Silver Bullets podcast. I am Michael Citro.
And I'm Chip Minnich.
And Chip, you and I have some Buckeye football to talk about, finally, because this was the annual spring game. The return of the spring game happened this past weekend on Saturday. Of course, it's a much different spring game than you and I kind of grew up with. Very much more controlled practice type thing now than it used to be, where they would pick sides and you would have an actual game, and now you don't really have that anymore. In fact, we didn't even have Scarlet and Gray teams this year. We had Brutus and Buckeye. Did you get a chance to get a good look at the 2021 Buckeyes on Saturday?
Yeah, I think as much as you described it, I think that like you said, a controlled scrimmage. Getting a feel for how this team is going to potentially look in the fall. It was great to see a lot of the new players, as we'll discuss, as well as to actually see people in the stands.
Yeah, it was cool to see that. I don't know how many. What did they have? Like 15,000 people?
I think so, something like that. I mean, it was, the so many people that were, which I thought was a very smart move by Ohio State, giving tickets to the first responders and students, and I'm not entirely sure as to like the general public. I just know that it was, according to everything I read, I mean, it was the demand for inclusion into the stadium was pretty high.
Yeah, on TV it looked very very spaced out. I've just started, the MLS season just started also on Saturday. And, you're aware that I'm the managing editor of a blog that covers Orlando City SC in MLS. And they had, I think, about, 13,000 at the stadium, and they looked a lot more packed in. Of course, it's a much smaller stadium. They looked much, much more packed together than the folks that went to the spring game. They looked like they were quite socially distanced at the spring game.
Again, I think they kind of addressed that on the telecast about they're simply following the social protocol in terms of spacing and things like that. So, but you're right. I mean, when you're talking 100,000 plus capacity stadium and you're only allowing 15 to 20,000 people in, it's going to look, very, very spacious in comparison.
Yeah. I mean, I think back to watching Clemson games last year, and they had, there were games when it looked like Clemson didn't have a lot of empty seats. So, obviously that's just part and parcel of how the Big Ten handled the pandemic as opposed to, the ACC and the SEC last year. But we don't have to get into that. Why don't we talk a little bit about the spring game? Just give me some overall thoughts of what kind of stood out for you.
Well, as I said at the beginning, I think that there were certainly players who impressed. I know we'll get into greater detail about that. There are certain position groups that I think truly Ohio State is well stocked. The wide receivers especially. I think that that was quite blatantly obvious. And I mean, we'll talk about the idea of some areas that I guess when I probably used the wrong term when I sent you the agenda about areas of concern, because let's face it, like you said, it wasn't an actual game. It was just kind of a controlled scrimmage, and Ryan Day and the coaching staff, they left the spring game with the number one commandment being that nobody got hurt. I mean, you left the game, or I should say you left spring practice healthy. So I wouldn't say that there are necessarily areas of concern, but maybe like areas that I'm still unsure of or uncertain as to how well Ohio State will be this coming fall. But overall, it was just great to see live football again. It was great to see fans in the stands. It was great to see the band. on at
yeah.
halftime. I mean, so it's just one of those things where I think it was just nice to see a glimpse as to what Ohio State may look like in 2021.
And one of the things that stood out to me was how much of the bullet we saw on Saturday. And, we hear about the bullet, and I think Tony Gerdeman and Tom Moore joked a lot about, the bullet is kind of right up there with year of the tight end at Ohio State, and it never really seems to happen. But, is this a ruse, do you think? were we just seeing a lot of bullet because there weren't as many linebackers healthy, or are we seeing it because they're going to use it? What are obviously it's all guesswork at this point, but what are your thoughts on that?
Well, thank you. I do think it is guesswork. I don't believe it's a ruse. I think it's going to be deployed. The bullet position will be deployed based on down and distance and obviously the opponent. So for example, if Ohio State's playing a team that is, more of a spread attack, I think the bullet certainly would be used. But by the same token, if Ohio State, let's say that they line up against Wisconsin, I don't think you're going to see the player or the players, because there were a few that were listed and shown during the game, I don't think the bullet would be necessarily required. So I certainly think it's going to be dependent upon the circumstance of who Ohio State is actually playing, and certainly the kind of style of offense that they're using against the Buckeyes.
Okay. I think you're right on. I think that we'll see some bullet this year. In fact, I think we'll see a lot more of it than we have. I mean, it's been very, very sparing the last few years, but I think we're going to see more of it. And I think the reason why is I think Craig Young enables them to use it more. And obviously they used it some last year where it didn't really necessarily look like the bullet because Pete Werner, you had a Pete Werner, so sometimes they used it and we didn't even realize watching the game that they were in that. But I think we'll see more of it this year that will be recognizable. Chip, I guess we can go through this a little bit and figure out like kind of what stuck out to us. I think we're probably going to have very similar notes through this segment. But let's just start with the thing that everybody wanted to see, which was the quarterback battle. And, obviously the narrative coming out of this from fans will be that Jack Miller III, had the worst game of the three, and maybe he's fallen behind. But I don't think necessarily that's the case. We see him one day, and we didn't see him for all the other practices, which the coaching staff did. Certainly C.J. Stroud looked very, very strong. I don't know that you can take much from the spring game alone on this, and I know the coaches won't be doing that either. But this was our first chance to see them, so let's overreact. What's going on at the quarterback position?
Yeah, let's overreact. I'm glad that you preface it by saying that this was just one of the 15 practices, and as you accurately stated, neither you or I, or let's just say, like the vast majority of the Ohio State fan base, the media did not really get a chance to see all of the different practices and plays that the quarterbacks participated in. I would agree that I think on Saturday in the spring game that Jack Miller III probably in terms of overall performance was behind C.J. Stroud and Kyle McCord, but I certainly don't think he did anything to completely disqualify him from the quarterback race. I'm sure that behind the scenes that Ryan Day and Corey Dennis and the other offensive coaches are doing everything they can to reassure Jack Miller that, yes, you are still in this, because that's the last thing in the world that they want is for any of these quarterbacks to leave before fall camp begins, because they certainly want to have a fully stocked quarterback room going into this fall.
Yeah, I know that they want that, and they also want I think they also want to use that fall camp to solidify the position. I don't think that necessarily anybody's mind is made up yet in that, on that staff. I mean, they might be leaning one way, but I don't think that anybody has, from what we've heard, we obviously have access to the insiders board. It's buckeyescoop.com. And so from the reports we're seeing and from behind the scenes and from what we've seen with our own eyes, I would say that, maybe Stroud is the lean, but I don't think he's clearly distanced himself and claimed that spot yet. So I think that the challenge is obviously to make all of these kids feel like they are still in it. And I think they actually are still in it. But so I don't think that Ryan Day should have any trouble, with that. It's just a matter of confidence right now. And he's got to make sure that those guys are confident enough to in their own, ability to say, look, even if I have somebody in mind right now, it's not, it's not a done deal. You have to, work hard over the summer, come in here in the fall, and we haven't put anybody's name in pen on that QB1 line yet.
One of the best lines I thought during the broadcast, they, considering James Laurinaitis was one of the commentators, but more importantly, Joshua Perry was the sideline reporter, and they asked Joshua Perry about his memories of the 2015 quarterback battle. And Joshua made a really strong point about, it truly was the very first play of the game when Ohio State was at Virginia Tech that the players finally knew who was going to start. And the point being that it was more of a distraction that the players really, they didn't really want that. They wanted to have some clear definition. So I think, going back to what we're talking about here as it relates to all three players, I don't think anyone necessarily, I agree that CJ Stroud probably would lean towards being the leader, but I don't think any of the three did anything to disqualify themselves. And I think it's incumbent upon Ryan Day and the coaches to do everything they can to keep them motivated through the summer into fall camp. And then let's just say, I'm just going to throw out let's just say the middle of August. I'm not going to say necessarily like a date specific. That's when I would hope that Ryan Day would learn from the past quarterback battles, that he'll announce who's going to be the starter when Ohio State goes on the road at Minnesota for September 2nd.
Yeah, I think they're going to want to know, he's a quarterback guy. He's going to want to know that and make that decision, as I don't want to say as early as he can, because it makes it sound like he's in a hurry, because he's not. But I think he would like to know with a couple weeks to go before the season so that he could prepare his starting quarterback with the appropriate number of reps and the backup with the appropriate number of reps and so forth. So that's what I'm kind of looking for, is a couple of weeks before that first game. We may not get an announcement, but I think he'll internally make it known who that is. I don't think that's going to be a case of like Urban Meyer on the sideline telling, he's got Cardale there, he's got JT there, telling, and neither one of them knows who's starting the game.
Yeah, I think, like when I think back on, you referenced previous spring games. I mean, when I think about some of the spring games that I attended, or that I'm sure that you attended, or that you remember, like what was interesting, when I think back to like the last, I guess if you want to say three-man quarterback race was 1996. And the only reason why that kind of brings to mind is that going into that spring game, it was not necessarily considered a three-man race. It was supposed to be between Mark Garcia and Stanley Jackson. And then all of a sudden this unknown kid comes in and actually looked the most impressive of the three, and it was Joe Germain. So out of the 1996 spring game, all of a sudden you're thinking, okay, this is a three-man race. And then as it went into the fall, I can't remember the circumstances, but it turned into a two-man race between Joe Germain and Stanley Jackson. But the point being that it did kind of help to split that team. There were a lot of Joshua Perry he kind of referred to, it was very unsettling for the players not to necessarily know, in terms of leadership and things like that. That 1996 team, it bled into 1997, the same kind of thing. So I think they certainly want to have all three quarterbacks involved and motivated and believing that they can win the job. But I would certainly hope that Ryan Day, like you said, being a quarterback guy, is going to make a decision to get whoever is going to be the first string quarterback enough reps with the first team unit so that the offense feels very cohesive going into the season opener.
Yeah, I remember well the Joe Germain Stanley Jackson battle, and I just wonder what might have changed, in terms of the record, in terms of accomplishments, if it had just done the right thing and named Joe Germain the starter.
Yeah, you often wonder that, and it's the kind of thing where in in a previous conversation I had with Stanley Jackson on that issue, that they both knew, according to Stanley Jackson, that Stanley Jackson was told by Walt Harris, who was the quarterback coach at the time, that Stanley Jackson was told going into 1996, you're not good enough to play here. And Mark Garcia was kind of his guy. And then Mark Garcia, let's face it, did not really do anything. And I remember distinctly that spring game kind of coming out very underwhelmingly in comparison to both Joe Germain and Stanley Jackson. So yeah, it's one of these things where I think you kind of wonder, like getting back to what we're talking about in present day, like the coaches, they all see everything. They chart every pass. They have access to the tape, all the things that you and I and the fans and everyone else doesn't. Like we kind of watch the spring game and like, oh, okay, well, it certainly looks like C.J. Stroud or Kyle McCord look better. But as you alluded to, the insider board, there have been times where some people have said Jack Miller has made this much more competitively than people previously thought.
Yeah, I mean, there were times when we heard CJ was ahead and times that we heard Miller was ahead, and McCord would have, a couple of, maybe a few down days, and then he would look great for a few days, which, you'd expect that from a freshman. Yeah, you bring up Mark Garcia, and it's a guy who I think even back then it was, you didn't hear tons and tons. You don't have the recruiting news that you have today. But he was a name that you heard, in terms of the incoming class. And, this was a name that you were waiting to see this guy that you'd heard about. And he never materialized. And, we ended up getting the split Jermaine Jackson, sounds like a musician, but we had that situation for a while at Ohio State, and then I think that there were games when Joe Germain looked fantastic, other games when he looked kind of average, and Stanley Jackson looked pretty decent one day and not very good the next day, and I'm sure that one person who I'm sure is glad that Stanley Jackson got to play as much as he did was Charles Woodson.
Yeah, that's true. That is, unfortunately true. But yeah, it was, when you think back on that quarterback battle, like I said, it certainly seemed, at the time that there were, it was the kind of thing where it was dividing certainly the fan base, but also Stanley Jackson was very popular with his teammates. So the possibility of splitting the team. And, we've talked about the Cardale JT Barrett 2015 issue that kind of the offense never really, when you look back on that season, to be as fair as possible, that offense never really seemed to get on track. Until the tail end, unfortunately, of the season. Probably my fondest quarterback battle spring game, without a doubt, just because it had no bearing on the upcoming season, and it was one of these things where Jim Tressel truly just kind of let them play. And this might have been where the legend of Bam Childress developed, to be quite honest, was the 2003 spring game, because when you think about it, you had Craig Krenzel coming back, Scott McMullen was coming back. In the second half of that spring game was Justin Zwick versus Troy Smith, and it was basically bombs away for both of them. I mean, kind of what we saw a little bit on this past Saturday with throwing the ball all over the field.
Mm-hmm.
But it was a kind of it was a beautiful sunny day. I remember distinctly because, being in the stands, and I remember thinking, okay, leaving that spring game thinking, okay, well, it seems like Justin Zwick had a leg up after that one going into, the 2003 season, but just knowing full well, hey, the same thing is going to happen all next year, so that's kind of, again, I give Ryan Day a lot of credit for throwing the ball all over the field with all three of the quarterbacks, even getting some of the walk-ons, Jagger LaRoe, especially at the end, getting to throw a touchdown pass. I think, getting as many quarterbacks involved, but especially the three scholarship quarterbacks, I really think that it gave the fans certainly an idea as to, who may be the starter this coming fall.
Yeah, and if you just go by the spring game, Glenn, clearly Jagger LaRoe is your starter.
Well, certainly. Yeah. I mean, yeah, like I said, I've always been, they talked about it a little bit on the telecast. I've always been a fan of the idea of the walk-ons getting an opportunity to play and shine, because let's face it, the opportunities to play in actual games are very, very few and far between. They even talked about that on the telecast. It's like there were no blowouts. So Jagger LaRoe, not getting a chance to play in actual game time, for him to throw that touchdown pass, to conclude the spring game, that was a nice way to finish up the spring, I think.
Yeah, and not just to play, but to play in Ohio Stadium, which is, the dream of every one of these kids when they sign on at Ohio State. And the bad thing last year was, I mean, forget about getting the walk-ons on. Ryan Day couldn't even get his freshmen on last year.
Right. That's kind of like we've talked about in the past, is that neither C.J. Stroud nor Jack Miller really had. I mean, they were in games, but they either handed the ball off or carried the ball. Neither of them threw a pass. Kyle McCord's never thrown a pass, so it doesn't matter which one of the three is playing against Minnesota. The very first pass that is attempted will be the very first one of their NCAA careers. Indeed,
and we're all looking forward to that happening. You brought up the one, some of these older quarterback battles. And one that I remember, I don't remember how it unfolded in the spring game, but I do remember how it unfolded during the season, because I happened to be, covering sports with the Lantern then, and I was the sports editor. And at the time, it was the battle between Kirk Herbstreit and Kent Graham. Do you remember that? I don't know if you have a recollection of how the spring game went.
I don't remember how the spring game went. I just know, Kent Graham, was, a transfer from Notre Dame. The fact that real strong arm, all this kind of stuff, and then because that had to have been after, I was going to say after Greg Fry.
Yes, it was.
So, Greg Fry had moved on. And so the fact that, all right, so now you've got Kent Graham, Kirk Herbstreit, and Herbstreit had established himself, at least at the high school ranks, as being more of, like an option style quarterback. So I think that's what, like the completely different styles.
Yeah, they were very different. I remember I wrote a column for the Lantern about the quarterback battle, and the thing that stuck out to me was that Kent Graham was going to be a 1-year starter, and he's a statue. I mean, he has no wheels at all. He's your prototypical stand in the pocket, and if he has to scramble, you'll be lucky if he gets back to the line of scrimmage. That type of guy. And for what Ohio State had athletically on offense, it seemed like Kirk Herbstreit was the better fit for the offense. The offensive package. You'll remember they ran more option play back then. You couldn't do that with Kent Graham in there. And and also Herbstreit had that explosive burst that he could make something happen if a guy missed it or read the play wrong, and he could make a big play out of just a normal option play. But again, it was one of those cases where they just kind of screwed around. Both guys played, and it was a pretty average season. But I think that also, you had a similar situation in terms of Stanley Jackson and Joe Germain, in that you had a guy who, the kids at Ohio State knew this guy. They knew Stan Jackson, they knew Kirk Herbstreit, and then you have this guy coming in, transferring in from outside. So you got the outsider Joe Germain and the outsider Kent Graham. Although in this case, Joe Germain was a much better quarterback than Kent Graham, and so there were some parallels there. And I think that it was a no-win situation. The coaches had who they liked and who they thought was the appropriate starter. Wasn't necessarily going to make the team happy, and if the team is not happy, you don't necessarily have a good foundation for the season.
And the thing is, getting back to present day and they, maybe you have a different opinion, is watching C.J. Stroud, watching Jack Miller, watching Kyle McCord is, I think, of the three, that C.J. Stroud probably has the best mobility, but I don't think any of the three are necessarily lacking mobility. I would say that they are certainly, and I'm just, in the recent past, I would say they're certainly better than Dwayne Haskins, for example.
Oh, for sure.
Who was
yeah.
you know what I mean?
Mm-hmm.
But by the same token, I'm kind of wondering, as I kind of speculate for this fall, how much of the zone read will be a factor of the offense, because this is meant with no disrespect to any of those three guys. I don't know how much of a factor the running will be in their respective games. I think it'll certainly be in there, but I just don't know, if they're certainly not going to be nearly the threat that we've grown accustomed to with Justin Fields the last two seasons.
Right. Stroud seems to be the most like him in terms of mobility. But I don't think you should be afraid of running your offense no matter who you got in there. I think that these, like you said, these guys move pretty well. They may not all be, Justin Fields. They're certainly not Braxton Miller, but they can do the job. I mean, I remember people were telling me before he transferred, that they didn't think Joe Burrow could run the ball, so they didn't see him playing at Ohio State. And I said, I think he can run the ball a little bit. I saw some of his high school film, and I thought, he's deceptive, and I think that we saw that at LSU with him. And I think these guys are as well. I think Miller and McCord are guys that I think will be deceptive, and they'll be able to get 5 or 6 yards, when they need to. I think at times, maybe not against the top defenses, but I think they can still get it done. But that shouldn't be the deciding factor either. I think right now it's going to come down to who makes the fewest mistakes, who gets his team in the best position to be successful. Leadership is going to be a big part of it, and taking care of the ball. And I think that you and I and nobody that watches spring game, other than maybe the coaching staff, are equipped at this point to make that assessment.
I agree. And I also agree with something that Tom Orr has said, even I think prior to the spring game, and certainly after watching the spring game, I agree with Tom's assessment, is that the limited opportunities that I had to watch all three play, I would agree with Tom when he says that you could certainly see Ohio State winning the Big Ten championship with any of those three quarterbacks. That they certainly possess. They all are very talented, and I think the Ohio State quarterback position, regardless of who is selected as the starter, is in very good hands for 2021. Well
said. All right, before we get into some of the guys who stood out to us, I think we've covered the quarterbacks pretty well. We'll take a quick break, and we'll come back and we'll dissect the spring game a little bit more right after this. And we're back. Chip, the spring game is always a little bit of a tease, especially when you've got a strong incoming class of running backs, because you never really get to see a good running game in the spring game. So I don't know that we can take a whole lot out of the running back position from Saturday. There was a decent run by Travion Henderson and another decent one from Marcus Crowley, but not a whole lot of yards to be had on the ground, as you would expect. Did anything stick out to you at all about the running backs?
Not really. I'm glad that you, like you said, that's one of those areas where I kind of labeled that as unsure and uncertain going into the fall. Not that they lack talent. I'm not trying to say that. It's just, not really knowing, for example, what we really have, in terms of, like the fact like Master Teague was withheld. And, I think Mayan Williams, it wouldn't be surprising to me if Mayan Williams is actually the first, I guess you could say like first player rotated in after Master Teague. I think Master Teague will get the start against Minnesota. I think Mayan Williams is going to play. Travion Henderson definitely impressed. I think he showed, if not necessarily, and I know you're more of the stats guy. I mean, it was kind of, okay, what did he have, like 26 yards or something? Like, it wasn't really anything,
right?
So. But I was impressed with what I saw, especially his receiving out of the backfield. I think is going to be something that Ohio State will certainly try to capitalize on. I was certainly happy to see. We talked about Crowley getting back. I think he's still working his way back from his knee injury. So it's nice to see that he's slowly but surely regaining that confidence. Steel Chambers. So that's a crowded room, but kind of what we talked about with the quarterbacks, you want to keep them all happy, simply because, like that, what's that old adage, like you want to, like a pair and a spare.
Yeah.
The last thing in the world you want to do is have anyone looking at the depth chart and thinking that they're not going to be able to contribute or participate in the fall. So, the running backs themselves, I think, remains to be seen, but I think obviously the talent is certainly there for the 2021 season.
Yeah, only one rushing touchdown. It was Steel Chambers. I think Henderson had 4.3 yards per carry on 6 carries, and that for a spring game is actually pretty good. Marcus Crowley only carried it twice, and he had a 13-yard run, so he averaged 10 yards, which is deceptive. But I agree with you. I think Mayan Williams I think the coaching staff's very high on him. Teague obviously is your number one guy, but he may not necessarily play the most downs. I think he'll start the games, but I don't know if he'll play the most downs. And Travion Henderson, I'm intrigued by because what you said, he's catching the ball out of the backfield, which is great. It's something that hasn't been a regular part of the offense. Obviously, Trey Sermon was pretty good at it. But it hasn't really featured since, Zeke Elliott. I mean, Ezekiel Elliott was very good pass-catching running back. And I think that, we saw a little bit the last few years, but I don't think we necessarily saw enough of it with Dobby out of the backfield. I think he could have caught more passes.
Yes, and if there's a concern that I have about Travion Henderson is certainly there was a lot of hype about the recruiting aspects and things like that with James Laurinaitis, and this is not a critique of James Laurinaitis saying this, but when he said, I've heard the coaches sometimes refer to him as baby Saquon. I'm thinking, oh man, now like if he doesn't play as well as Saquon Barkley, you know what I mean? Like,
yeah,
that's it's a minor thing. I think, what you just said about Master Teague is I certainly think he is going to start the season as the number one tailback. Whether he remains the starting tailback throughout the season, that is something to be determined because Mayan Williams, like you said, Marcus Crowley, Travion Henderson. I completely neglected, like Evan Pryor had, so the talent and depth is there. It's going to just be interesting to see how the coaching staff decides to use all of these talented runners, because there's only one football, and
right.
you trying to keep. I mean, we haven't talked about the receivers yet. Trying to keep everybody happy is going to be a considerable chore.
Right. And Steel Chambers, I think, right in the mix if he can hold on to the ball, because his ability was never in question. It was, turnovers were an issue, and not just what we saw in games, but also he was having trouble in practice hanging on to the football. But we haven't heard those same stories in the spring, so maybe he's addressed that. Maybe he's got that under control.
Can certainly hope so, because again, the talent is there, like you said.
All right, so I think when we talk about the players that were impressive in this spring game, and we'll get to the defense in a minute, but most of those players lined up outside. I mean, the wide receiving talent on this team is ridiculous. We saw great stuff out of Marvin Harrison Jr., who was, the first offensive player to get his black stripe removed. Emeka Egbuka had a big game in this game. Obviously Chris Olave we know about. He can play a little bit. He had 3 catches, 57 yards, and a touchdown, which was almost not called a touchdown the first time. Garrett Wilson obviously can play. Jackson Smith and Jigba. I mean, this is a ridiculous receiver room. And when you start throwing the ball to the running backs as well, I mean, it's just the passing game should be devastating.
I have no doubt. And you're absolutely correct. I mean, Marvin Harrison Jr., Emeka Egbuka, Jaden Ballard at the tail end of the game was, making some receptions. Jameson Williams is possibly going to be nudged out of the starting position just because Jackson Smith and Jigba has been so impressive. We didn't even, because I think he is just rehabbing a minor injury and they didn't want to do anything to aggravate it. Julian Fleming didn't even play.
Right.
The talent and the talent of the receivers is so immense that G. Scott Jr. moved from wide receiver to tight end simply because I think he looks at the talent that's there and that is coming in and figured that was the best move he could possibly make. But without a doubt, I think, I realize we talked about the quarterbacks and we just discussed the running backs. The receivers on this team, I mean, it's going to be, if the quarterbacks struggle, it's certainly not from a lack of talent around them. I can assure you of that.
And if we could ever keep him healthy, from what we hear, Cameron Babb is as good as anybody too.
Yeah, that's the thing that was so unfortunate, is that at the beginning of the spring, we were hearing good things about Cameron Babb. And then, unfortunately, he suffered an injury. So I can only hope that he can come back in the fall and be a contributor.
It would be nice, but it really seems like the door is closing on him, especially when you look at who is in practice every day and showing this incredible talent. I mean, it's an embarrassment of riches, and I'm not unhappy to see it. I mean, because we've, for many years, Ohio State receiving recruiting wasn't that great. You'd always have 1 or 2 guys, but you didn't really have a lot behind them. And now, some of the guys that are going to end up probably even transferring, I'm not going to speculate on that, but I mean, I don't see any way you keep all of these young guys, especially with some of the other young guys that are already lined up to come in. So some of them are going to go off and have great careers elsewhere. Some of them are going to have great careers at Ohio State. We already saw, Mookie Cooper leave. So, it's something it's just part of college football now. But it's great to start with this many excellent prospects, knowing you're probably not going to be able to keep everybody.
Well, like you said, we already knew how terrific Chris Olave and Garrett Wilson are. And all right, so they're back, and we saw glimpses of greatness like we've been discussing. I mean, I think it's going to be an interesting challenge for the coaches to keep everybody happy and involved, because let's hope that Ohio State has blowouts, because we want to see these other wide receivers, like get involved, because I'm sure it's going to be one of these challenges that Ryan Day and Brian Hartline are going to have, is like trying to keep everybody motivated and involved throughout the season, rotating. I think just by our count, like we're looking at 7 players easily that, in terms of like the wide receiver rotation that you would possibly want to have involved throughout the season.
Right. And the thing is that Ryan Day has not shown that he wants to throw the ball in a blowout, but I mean, this year I don't think he has a choice, because he's going to have a first-year starting quarterback. He's going to have a backup and a backup to a backup who have never thrown a pass in college football. So he's going to have to let them throw it a little bit.
I agree. And I think, maybe it's just me. Maybe I'm old school. I don't have a problem throwing the ball when you're up. I don't care, like if it's a slant or a hitch or whatever. That then if the receiver takes it the distance, because we talked about blowouts, things like that. Like 2 years ago, Jameson Williams did precisely that against Miami of Ohio. That's not Ohio State's fault that you're going to tell this kid, okay, he gets an opportunity to go out as a true freshman, catches a pass, takes it the distance. That's not Ohio State's fault that you're going to tell him not to run fast. You're going to tell him not to score. I mean, it's seriously, it's like, so I think there's a big difference between chucking the ball for the end zone and throwing the ball. And if the receivers can make plays that get them in the end zone, I think there's a philosophical difference there. That's just my opinion.
Right. We're not asking them to throw wheel routes or 9 routes or any of that.
Right.
But if they do happen to take it to the house, to me it's more embarrassing if the guy slowed down and just kneeled down inside the 5-yard line, right?
Oh yeah, I agree.
So that's just it going in, and I thought the same thing last year. Is if there were blowouts, and you put C.J. Stroud and Jack Miller in the game, they have to get reps. So that's something that you just address after the game. You say, look, I got 2 young quarterbacks, and I need to get them some throws. So I wasn't trying to run it up on you. I'm just using this time productively.
Well, we're about, let's say, 5 months away from what will be known as the Akron Massacre. So, you know what I mean?
Yeah.
It's like, how are you gonna prevent that?
I don't know.
We were just talking about Miami of Ohio. I mean, Akron is dreadful. It's going to be one of these things where no matter what, you're going to have difficulty keeping the score down. So
you hope, because if not, that means the young quarterback isn't getting the job done.
Right. Exactly.
Yeah. All right. Did anybody on the offensive line stand out to you? I have to admit, I wasn't focused in on the line play as much as I normally am.
I wouldn't say necessarily that they stood out for their play. I will say they just stood out for their size. That's DeJuan Jones.
Yeah, right.
I mean, on a team of very large individuals, DeJuan Jones stands out just because, it's not, it's just kind of uncanny. Just the sheer size that he has. So I will say, I think it's going to be interesting the way that this all will shake out, because Harry Miller was withheld from competition this spring, and there had been so much speculation going into the spring, like, okay, Harry Miller is going to move to center. Well, after this spring with Matthew Jones and Luke Whippler, possibly, they've been competing. It might not make sense. Like, I'm not saying that Harry Miller can't play center by any stretch. Again, we're not involved in terms of the practice evaluations, things like that. But it wouldn't surprise me if Harry Miller stayed at guard, and that, maybe Matthew Jones or Luke Whippler win that starting center position. But it's certainly glad. I'm certainly glad to read and hear that Paris Johnson had a solid spring. I just mentioned DeJuan Jones, like, you've got talent and depth there. The fact that, Nicholas Petit Frere, like he was kept out of the game, on Saturday just for precautionary reasons. Thayer Munford played. So I have every confidence in Coach Stud that he's going to pick his best five and have another group of players behind them ready to go. It's just very, very reassuring to see that Ohio State has rebuilt its depth along the offensive line, that they actually have, three solid units ready to go at the offensive line positions.
Yeah, a little bit bummed that Max Ray has entered the transfer portal. That has happened since you and I last did a show a couple weeks ago. So, that eats into the depth a little bit, but he's got a chance to go start somewhere else.
He does, and from everything that I understand is he's leaving with no bitterness towards Ohio State, that he had a tremendous experience. He's just looking at the depth chart where he resides on it and recognizing the fact that he wants to play, and time is slowly but surely ticking, and wants to make sure that he gets an opportunity to play. So wish him nothing but the best.
Yeah. All right, Chip, let's address the defense. I think you and I would both agree that we like what we saw from Jack Sawyer.
I'm going to paraphrase a modern-day warrior, Jack Sawyer. Yeah, he certainly, we were just talking about the offensive line, so let's keep things in perspective that, he had some moments, Grant Toutant, who was a redshirt freshman offensive line, Enoch Vimahi as a guard, moved out to tackle. Zeb Mikulski, some of those sacks. Yeah, it's like, okay, well, he wasn't necessarily going up against Thayer Munford or DeJuan Jones,
right.
But certainly very, very impressive. It would be tremendously shocking if Jack Sawyer is not in the rotation of defensive ends that Coach Johnson likes to usually deploy against Ohio State opponents.
Yep. Another guy who flashed for me, Taraja Mitchell. In fact, maybe he was hitting a little harder than the coaches would have liked him to.
Probably. James Laurinaitis kind of alluded to that in the sense that, this idea of like thud. It's not really easy for these defensive players. So, yeah, I think Taraja Mitchell trying to make a name for himself. But, yeah, he's certainly impressed.
A couple other guys who seem to be in on the action a lot were Tommy Eichenberg and Cody Simon.
Again, that linebacker depth. Happy to see, Tommy Eichenberg. Memory serves, Tommy Eichenberg was the very first recruit to commit to Ohio State after Ryan Day took over from Urban Meyer. And kind of the, significance of that was, all right, this is not somebody who, there was a lot of Ryan Day trying to keep players in the fold naturally, if they were wavering about should I go to Ohio State or not. Tommy Eichenberg was one of these guys who said, yeah, I want to go and play for Coach Day. He decommitted from Boston College, took the scholarship opportunity from Ohio State. And he certainly shows a nose for the football and physical style of play that I think will serve him well, especially against traditional Big Ten opponents.
Yeah, I'm interested to see what this year's crop of linebackers will end up looking like at the end of the day. I mean, it's there's they're going to be hungry, and sometimes that's half the battle with linebackers, and they've been waiting their turn for quite some time because you don't normally get a crop of linebackers that just start from an early age and progress through as starters year after year like that, like Ohio State just had with Tuff Borland and Pete Werner.
No, and let's face it, we were talking earlier about the prevalence of the bullet, the fact that, a lot of these linebackers, it's going to be interesting to see, as I said earlier, what kind of personnel Ohio State's going to deploy depending on who they're playing against. Like some of the linebackers. No offense to Tommy Eichenberg, but I think if they're playing against a more of a traditional spread team, I don't know if is Tommy Eichenberg going to be the guy out there. By the same token, I think Roger Mitchell will be out there no matter who. I think he certainly will be out on the field. We talked earlier about Craig Young. I think he certainly showed a lot of versatility, even though I shouldn't say rumor, that he was playing a lot more with the safeties. Same thing with Ronnie Hickman. I think, that versatility to be able to kind of be, that, like you said, like the role that Pete Werner demonstrated the last few years. I think both of them showed a lot at that bullet position. So yeah, I think the linebackers, that Ohio State will be in very good shape come fall.
All right. Anybody else on defense stick out for you? Did anybody impress you in the secondary? I mean, obviously there were a lot of receiving yards in this game, but those are really, really good receivers. I don't think it's necessarily a knock on the DBs. Anybody catch your eye?
Yeah, I think going into the fall, I think Ryan Watts certainly is going to be more of a factor than he was last year. I say that simply because, let's face it, and this kind of falls, you're talking about the linebackers a moment ago, talking about the secondary, like you said, very accurately, a lot of passing yards, the conditions of the spring game rules did not really lend itself to the linebackers and secondary showing up and being dominant. But when you think about the secondary, we talked about this on a previous podcast, Seven Banks being out for the spring, Cameron Brown still rehabbing. I think Ryan Watts represented himself well, obviously on that interception. I think that was more of Jack Miller pressing, trying to force that throw, and Ryan Watts capitalized on it. But the larger point being that I think Ryan Watts represented himself well in the secondary as being, possibly like a third corner. A couple other guys that I thought flashed in the secondary, Lathan Ransom and Cameron Martinez. I think that they'll certainly play. I don't know necessarily start, but I think Lathan Ransom certainly seems likely to start. I think Cameron Martinez will seem likely to play come fall.
Yeah, I like what I saw from Cam Martinez as well. I thought he didn't look out of place out there. It seemed like Hickman was in on a lot of tackles. I don't necessarily know if that's a good thing, but he was out there making some plays, and so that's, he's going to be in the mix to try to get some playing time as well. And that's pretty much it. I was trying to watch DeMario McCall, but I really didn't. I don't know that the broadcast angle really helped me with that very much. Did you get a chance to watch him at all?
Well, I saw, I think it was Chris Olave went up over his back to make I can't remember. It was either Olave or Garrett Wilson, but I think DeMario McCall certainly did not look out of place as a defensive back. I could see the more reps he gets, I think the better he will be. So I don't think he was as impressive as some of the players that we mentioned, like Cam Martinez and Ryan Watts. But I certainly think at a position where Ohio State is certainly lacking a lot of depth and experience, it certainly makes sense for DeMario McCall to continue learning the position and possibly contributing in nickel packages for Ohio State in 2021.
I'm looking at the game stats here. I don't see his name as having been in on any tackles, so that's too bad. But yeah, an interesting one for sure. Okay, I'm going to give you my disappointment of the spring game. Are you ready?
Okay.
All right. The punting. I wanted better punting, especially from an Aussie. I thought Jesse Mirko should have been boom with no rush. I thought he should have been booming 70-yard kicks.
Very good point. I think in all seriousness, the fact that there was no rush, I was going to also say that Jake Seibert, I apologize if I mispronounced the name, the missed field goals was unsettling in a similar fashion, because, all right, we're not talking about the game on the line, heavy rush, any of that kind of stuff. We talked about previous spring games. I remember distinctly Urban Meyer almost basically didn't matter who the kicker was, like basically getting in their face and just continually making them move back 5 yards, 5 yards, 5 yards, trying to see what kind of range that they had. So let's just hope that for both Jesse Mirko on the punting side, Siebert on the place kicking, that maybe it was just not necessarily their day, because again, let's hope Ohio State's not in tight game situations, but we both know that that's not necessarily always going to be the case.
Right. Well, we know the punt is the most important play in football, and that's going to need to be shored up. But they elevated the special teams coordinator of the offseason.
They did, and all the talk is that they're going to try to have as many starters involved and try to be more creative on special teams than they have in the past. So, like I said, let's hope that maybe in a more traditional style game that the special teams will certainly be more impressive than they were on Saturday.
Mm-hmm. Well, maybe this is all rope-a-dope on Ryan Day's part. It's just let's just show people that we can't do special teams, and then we'll just come out and just rip everyone's head off on special teams when the season starts.
There you go. That might be the strategy.
Yeah, I'm sure that's something like that. It's got to be. All right. Any residual spring game topics that you want to cover before we move on?
One last player that I wanted, because we were talking about offense and defense, and that would be converted tight end Cade Stover. Had it didn't count, it didn't show up in the stats, but it certainly on the highlight, the one-handed catch that he had when he was going out of bounds. Only reason I'm bringing that up is just simply because, we all know that Jeremy Ruckert's the starter at tight end, but it's nice to see that Cade Stover is making the move over to tight end. And I think he will certainly go into fall camp as the number 2 tight end and certainly play more than he has in previous seasons.
Yeah, that's a good point. I think he'll do well in that role, and I'm always intrigued by guys who come over from defense to offense, because they get used to hitting people, and it usually shows up in the running game when they're throwing blocks.
Well, we talked about this on a previous podcast. One of the things that I really respected about Cade Stover is that when he verbally committed to Ohio State, he's from a farming community, takes pride in it. This guy, I mean, his recruiting commitment was very nondescript. I think, it was basically him, I think, either riding a tractor or going out to something on, some piece of farming equipment. Anyway, I'm being completely serious. I think Cade Stover is just basically a football player. You know what I mean? Like, it doesn't matter. And I think, like, to your point about being physical, I think he certainly established himself as a receiver on Saturday in the spring game. But I think throughout the spring practices, I think he established himself as that legitimate number 2 tight end who can, as you said, help in the running game, especially on the blocking side.
Yeah, I agree. And I think he'll be out there. I think we'll see a lot of him this fall. All right. Well, anything else from the spring game, Chip, that you want to get off your chest? Are we gonna?
No,
good?
I mean it wasn't. It wasn't like the traditional spring games like you and I have grown accustomed to, but the number one commandment of the spring game for the coaches is let's get out of here with everybody healthy. And they did that. And now, we have something to look forward to, for the next few months, just kind of speculating as to who's going to be starting at different positions.
Yeah, it was a little bit scary on that front when Garrett Wilson made that first catch, but luckily it looked like he just got the wind knocked out of him, got up, and was very emphatic about his big catch. So it all worked out. Chip, let us turn our attention to former Buckeye and a former Buckeye great, in fact, a standout. You might even call him a Heisman Trophy winner. And that's only because he won a Heisman Trophy, but, still. Eddie George has entered the coaching ranks.
This was a surprise, to say the least, because maybe I'm mistaken. I certainly welcome it. I think the sport welcomes it, to have somebody of Eddie George's stature join the coaching ranks. I think it's tremendous. I say it's a surprise because Eddie George, in his post-football career, seemed like he had other interests and ventures going on. Mm-hmm. I never ever realized that coaching was something he entertained as something he wanted to do. Like case in point being, I think that Eddie George had invested his money in a number of different businesses. Like I think like one of them being like a landscaping, obviously a restaurant, and then I seem to recall seeing information about Eddie George starring as Billy Flynn in a production of the musical Chicago. So right. I never ever realized that football coaching was something that was even an interest.
And of course, he's done some studio work, for football broadcasts as well.
That's right.
So, but yeah, Eddie George just kind of came out of nowhere, was named the head coach of Tennessee State University on April 13th. And that one was a little surprising, but maybe Tennessee State, he's obviously very well known in the state of Tennessee from his time with the Titans. Maybe they just made him an offer too good to turn down.
Well, I've said this before, and about the typical coaching career, if you think about it, like when you think about Urban Meyer or Ryan Day, the typical coaching career is, all right, well, you start out on the lower level of, kind of like being a graduate assistant. Like, for example, like Urban Meyer was a graduate assistant under Earl Bruce for 2 years, or Ryan Day was a graduate assistant, under Urban Meyer, 1 year, and all those, and you slowly but surely, like, you get an opportunity at these lower level schools as an assistant, rise up the ranks. But the fact that your usual first job is something kind of out of the spotlight. And when right. I think about Eddie George, or let's just say like Deion Sanders, because he's, kind of in this, the same thing, is like they're used to the spotlight, no matter where, like you said, former Heisman Trophy winning, player Eddie George, they're used to the spotlight. But I think in a way, the fact that, okay, well, instead of having to kind of grind up the coaching ranks, at a school like Tennessee State, or in the case of like Deion Sanders, like Jackson State, okay, it's the spotlight is not nearly as intensive on the school itself, because let's face it, it's not as high profile of a position like an Ohio State is.
Sure.
So
sure.
That might be, I don't know. I mean, it's just, like you said, he's certainly well known. His fame and reputation precede him. It certainly seems like he's assembling a very good coaching staff, in the sense like Pepe Pearson,
right,
is now on the staff. He's getting Rod Woodson to coach the secondary, and former head coach, Jeff Fisher as kind of like as a mentor, and I think Hugh Jackson is also going to be involved. So, I mean, it's going to be interesting to see what kind of results, but I'm happy for him if this is the direction he wants to take.
Yeah, it'll be interesting to watch. I mean, if nothing else, those Tennessee State scores are not something that I looked for on the ticker, but I'll be looking for them now.
Well, yeah, I mean, it's the kind of thing where the games aren't televised. I have no idea what kind of crowds they get, but again, if this is something he would like to pursue, why not, take advantage of the fact, like you said, he's well known throughout Tennessee, and just use this as an opportunity to possibly springboard into bigger coaching opportunities if they present themselves.
Yeah. I don't know that has the Pepe Pearson thing become official. I know that was reported, but I didn't see it. I didn't see it anywhere where they had said that it actually had been announced.
I'm going off of what it said on footballscoop.com, but you might be right. I might be premature in making that announcement.
Yeah, the Tennessean reported that, according to reports, he was expected to be named running backs coach, and I think Clay Hall maybe reported that as well. But it is, as far as I could tell, it hasn't happened. But yeah, Hugh Jackson involved. Certainly, Jeff Fisher's a good person to have the ear of if you're becoming a first-time head coach. So we wish Eddie the best of luck. It's not easy. It's not an easy job to coach college football, and like you said, he didn't come up through the ranks as a grad assistant, and then a position coach, and then a coordinator. So, some sports lend themselves to you're done playing, you go right into coaching, and I don't know that football is one, but Eddie's never shied from a challenge before.
No, he hasn't, and just another case in point. Brian Hartline, we were singing the praises of his recruiting prowess and the results on the field. I seem to recall reading somewhere that Urban Meyer was, I don't want to say concerned, but he wondered, Brian Hartline had a successful Ohio State career, a successful NFL career. Did he really want to put in the hours and do all of the grunt work that assistant coaches do? And obviously Brian Hartline has demonstrated that. So yeah, I mean, it's just how people get to their final destination. It's not anything set in stone that you have to necessarily do it this way. I think, hats off to Eddie George for kind of taking a surprising route into a profession that I think nobody really expected him to take.
Yeah. Well, it's going to be, like I said, I'm going to be watching the, looking at the scores to see how his team's doing. And I think that where you can use the star power of an Eddie George and a Rod Woodson is in the recruiting. And at a school like that can make all the difference in the world.
Absolutely. When you're talking about a smaller school that has, we'll just say, limited resources, because again, I genuinely don't know in terms of like what kind of stadium or what kind of, like you said, like are there games ever televised? Being able to capitalize on, the head coach or the defensive coordinator in the case of Rod Woodson, their name. It's certainly anything you could do to kind of bring in talent into the program. You certainly want to do it.
Yeah, I will have Chip, that Tennessee State Tigers football team plays at both Nissan Stadium and Hale Stadium. Nissan Stadium you may have heard of, and it holds 69,143, and Hale Stadium holds 10,000. Okay.
So the 69,000 certainly, if they can play there more frequently, I'm sure that would be their preference.
Yeah, that is the home field of the Tennessee Titans, Nissan Stadium, and that has a much different capacity than Hale Stadium in Nashville. But if Eddie gets things going, maybe they'll want to play in Nissan more than Hale.
Certainly.
All right, Chip. Any other football related topics about the Buckeyes that you would like to discuss this week before we go back into our off week?
No, I'm good. I mean, if anything, I'm going to take advantage of between now and our next recording to try and watch other Big Ten teams, just to kind of get an idea as to how other Big Ten teams may look in going into 2021. But again, I'm kind of looking at it from the perspective, like they're not going to show a ton either. They just want to get people out of the spring healthy. And certainly looking forward to talking about the NFL draft in a couple weeks, to kind of see how everything turned out.
Yeah, no draft preview from us this year. We'll talk about it after the fact, but I'm looking forward to seeing where all those Buckeyes land, and especially a guy like Sean Wade. It's a question where he could end up. That'll be one of the ones that I'm watching throughout the day or throughout the couple of days. I don't think it'll be a first day pick, but the day after that, those are the days that I'll be watching and listening for Sean Wade's name to be called.
Among others,
Sure.
Ohio State is certainly not going to be suffering for a lack of possible selections. That's for sure.
They never are, my friend. They never are. All right. Well, with that, I think we're just gonna put a nice bow on the Silver Bullets podcast for this week. Thank you for listening. Chip, why don't you let people know where they can find you online?
I can be found on Twitter at Chip Minnich. Last name is spelled Minnich. And besides working on this podcast with Michael, I'm also a contributor to Athlon Sports, occasionally writing about Ohio State football. I recently wrote an article about the upcoming 2021 Ohio State season as it progresses from start to finish.
You will be able to find me on Twitter at Mike36Fan. That is my Twitter handle. And on Buckeye Scoop, I'm the grumpy old Buckeye, and my columns follow the morning after an Ohio State football game. So we'll see if that role expands or not. But for now, that's really all I have time to do. So look for us there, and we'll be back in a couple of weeks. We'll talk about the Buckeyes, where they were drafted, and obviously Justin Fields will be a big talking point for that show, and basically we'll just run down the whole group, and we'll figure out what everybody's situation looks like. And I'm looking forward to that one. That one's a fun time of year for Ohio State fans, especially in recent years, as we've seen so many Buckeyes drafted. Basically since Urban Meyer, it's just become a normal thing. It's like, let's find out where 5 or 6 or 7 or 8 or 11 guys go and play their pro ball. So looking forward to that. We will of course be back in 2 weeks. We are every other week in the off season. Please be sure to go check out all of our other shows on the Buckeye Scoop radio network, the Buckeye Weekly, Morning Scoop, Gives in the Bank, all of those shows, the Sloopcast, they all do a great job. Everybody brings a little something different to the table. And if you haven't done it yet, we're going to drive you crazy by saying it every week. Sign up, become an insider on Buckeye Scoop, because it's where you will get all the really meaty details out of stuff like spring practice, for example.
Without a doubt. We alluded to it a few times without necessarily giving away trade secrets, but you will certainly not be disappointed if you sign up and become on. If you frequent the Ask the Insiders, you will certainly be happy that you made that decision. I can promise you that.
Indeed. All right. Until next time, let's do what we always do at the end, Chip, and say, "Go Bucks!"
Go Bucks!